Hello and welcome to a new podcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. Today is Friday, September the 5th. This week was full of very special events and developments. But our story today is the launching of the Global Governance Initiative by the Chinese President Xi Jinping during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Plus summit in Tianjin in China. The question has been raised is whether China is planning to change or create its own world order according to its own vision of the world. Now, to discuss this, we have invited Mr. Einar Tangen, a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute in Beijing. And we are honored to have you with us to answer these questions, taking time from your busy schedule to inform us and our viewers about your thoughts.
My pleasure.
Before we get into the Global Governance Initiative, there was, of course, a lot happening in Beijing from Monday this week. And many people watched with shock and awe the cordial meetings in Beijing between Chinese President Xi Jinping and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And then the two together meeting with President of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and chatting and laughing together. This was a shock for many people, especially geopolitically minded people in the United States and in the EU. And some people like Peter Navarro, President Donald Trump's advisor on China affairs, threw a fit on television attacking India and asking them to choose sides. So anyway, what is your take on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Plus summit this week and its outcomes?
All right. The SCO has been around for a while now. It was originally started as a regional security compact. It was basically Russia, China, and the stands. What they were concerned about was separatism, extremism, terrorism. What they did, and this is important to understand, is that they were the opposite of NATO. And what I mean by that is NATO believes that the enemy that needs to be confronted is outside NATO. And they expand other countries in. And once you're in, you're not the enemy anymore, although that is changing. But they're looking or thinking that there's an enemy outside. For the SCO, the enemy is really within. There are those people who want to destabilize society because of their views. And these countries band together not to create an army, not to create a military alliance, but simply to protect each other from those who wish to, as I said, destabilize society. So it has morphed since then. And it's worth noting that if you start looking at the SCO and you start looking at the language that's used at the Belt and Road Initiative, and you also start looking at BRICS, the rhetoric is very, very similar. And there's a reason why. China has adopted a series of a vocabulary of describing what they see as a world that can work under a multipolar structure. And that structure is not ideological. It does not tell countries what they should do. Very simple ideas. One, every country needs to be secure. And their security cannot depend on the insecurity of another country. Two, every country has to have a path to development. The path to development is their own idea, and it should represent their own aspirations. No country has the right to stand in the way of the internal path of development of another country. Finally, respect. This is the Civilization Initiative. It has two parts to it, in my opinion. One, sovereignty. The fact is, most nations today were created by accidents of history. Who was king of what? Or by colonial powers who decided to draw lines literally in the sand because They thought it would be advantageous to them later on to put generally minority groups in charge of majority populations. Why? So that they could extend their influence after pretending to give up their colonial aspirations. And then finally, we have what we are going to be talking about perhaps later, global governance initiative, and how these all kind of figure in. So getting back to what happened this week at the SCO, at an unparalleled meeting, 30 countries gathering together to acknowledge the fact that they want to do more than just fight the enemy within, that economic security is as important as physical security. And what they've done is they've talked about the issues that need to be addressed. The wild card here was, of course, Narendra Modi. And India is showing up. Remember, there was only a scant less than 2 weeks ago that Wang Yi went to India, made a formal invitation to Modi, which was accepted. It wasn't certain up to that point what was going to happen, whether he was going to attend. Remember, 2 months prior, the Indian representative walked out of the meeting because they would not sign an anti-terrorism initiative pact squarely aimed against Pakistan. The reason they didn't wasn't because they also object to terrorism. That's the whole point of the organization. But they're not there to single out any one country unless there is irrefutable proof. And there wasn't at that time. Fast forward, they did sign this time, but it should be noted that it was not against Pakistan. It was against terrorism, right? All terrorism. And they cited what happened in India, and they also cited what is happening in Balochistan. Those who are being pulled off buses and summarily executed on the side of the road, and in terms of numbers, far more terrorist attacks than in India. India has been silent on them, something that I've brought up many times after appearing in about a week and a half. I made 30 appearances on Indian television. What's interesting is to hear the narrative from the Indian side and also the questions, because that tells you how they're approaching all of these ideas. A number of things were very clear. He did not understand why the US had done a 180-degree turn on India. Prior to that, India was the doorstop against Chinese expansion, and India kind of gloried in that. They took balancing, or as they would say, balancing roles against China at BRICS, at SCO, and also would not join the BRI. Although, ironically, if you go to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is based here in Beijing and has a high-level vice president representative, it is India who has received the most amount of loans from the AIIB. So, despite not being part of the Belt and Road Initiative, they do like expansion, investment, and infrastructure. So
yeah, I think India was one of the first to join the AIIB and also one of the major contributors to its capital, right?
That is correct. In fact, the political makeup is that the president is from China, and then you have 7 vice presidents who basically represent those who signed on very early. India was one of them. But just to put aside this notion that somehow India has been discriminated against by China, the fact that these loans are, the majority of these loans have gone to India is an indication that this is an international network. It is not influenced by politics. It is influenced by the ability to repay these loans. So when you put all of this together, India was at a situation where they say, well, we have a choice to make. We've been turned on again by the United States. Not only there, but they pointed to other incidents. One, interference in the general election, which Narendra Modi was looking to get to have a landslide so he could change India away from a provincial strong government to one that is more centrally strong in the mode of China, in the sense of being able to do central planning and implement. They also felt that very strongly that Bangladesh had been supported by the U.S. and that this claim that Donald Trump made that he settled the conflict between Pakistan and India was patently untrue. They saw it as an insult to Modi. And then this 50% tariffs coming literally out of nowhere, with Donald Trump's insistence that India open up its dairy and agriculture markets, when to do so would be political suicide. Over half of India is still in the rural areas. Taking away their livelihood, reducing the amount that they can earn in the dairy and agricultural areas would mean that a new government would be formed.
Yeah. By the way, literally, many Indian farmers commit suicide because of economic hardships. This is a known phenomenon.
Absolutely. And we're not talking about one or two, we're talking about hundreds each week. They get into debt. They have many children. They tried to divide the land among the children. And as a result, you get smaller and smaller areas. They take on loans for various reasons, and they cannot pay them back. And in desperation, they commit suicide. So this idea that you're taking from rich Indian farmers is completely false. You'd be forcing even more of them into desperate straits, but politically untenable. So you add all of this up, and all of a sudden Narendra Modi is in Tianjin with the rest of the world. And what is interesting is the optics of it, because there wasn't a lot of time to prepare, because no one was certain what was going to happen. But the optics were strong, extremely. You had Narendra Modi, you had Putin, you had Xi talking informally, laughing in a small group openly. Compare that to Donald Trump while he was playing schoolmaster to the EU as they sat around his desk, and they looked like they were being chided for, having been out too late the night before. Very, very different optics. And this is what is upsetting to Washington. I mean, they don't seem to understand that if you slap somebody, they don't appreciate it. I mean, literally, Navarro has been spewing invectives, a lot of it laced with racism against India. How is this going to convince India, who is very susceptible to, any kind of attack on its character or its nation, to come back to the U.S.? I mean, this "you better come back or else" doesn't play well politically. And the Indian populace is up in arms, but they still don't understand why this is happening. So Modi has ushered in a new day. He's signed on to agreements. He was there as they decided that, they're going to have a new pipeline deal, which is almost going to double the amount of Russian piped gas coming to China. Why is this important? It's through a border that no other country can have anything to do with. All right. This isn't like the Straits of Malacca. All right. This isn't like the Straits of Hormuz. This is a situation where these two countries can exchange. What else is important? Piped gas is about a third of the cost of LNG. LNG, you have to compress it, it has to be moved on special container ships, and then when it's received, it has to have special equipment to warm it up so that it can go into the lines. Much more expensive.
And also you can have enormously larger volumes on pipelines than by liquefied, on ships.
Absolutely. And you can turn up the volume. In terms of a pipeline, you cannot turn it up when you have a ship. So when you start, when he sees that and understands that neighbors are more important than the agendas of colonial empires who are in trouble. I think it has a profound influence. On returning to India, people were overjoyed. There was none of this, we should be going back to the United States. People who on Indian television had consistently just badmouthed China and said that the US is our savior, flipped 180 degrees, said that the treatment they have been receiving was unacceptable and that a new global order would have to emerge, one that did not allow this kind of embarrassment to happen.
Yeah. People forget, because here in the West, India is like a poor country, it's like they're treated like this. But the Indian people, they're proud people. They have an ancient civilization, and they don't see themselves the way we see them from outside. And that was a major underestimation and a big miss by the U.S. administration. So it was in this context you just wonderfully, showed us that President Xi Jinping presented the global governance initiative, and it was in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's Plus meeting itself. So the reactions here have been that China is together with Putin and Iran and other authoritarian regimes, they want to create a new world order that fits their own ambitions. That we're not going to discuss that, but what we want to discuss is the core of this initiative, because when you read the main principles, for example, like the issue of equal sovereignty of nations, multilateralism, cooperation, peaceful settlement of conflicts, and all these things, and economic cooperation, all these principles are not new. They're actually in the core of the United Nations Charter already in 1945. So the big question is now, why is China launching this now? What has changed?
Well, it's not only in the United Nations Charter back then, but it was also part of the non-aligned movement that was started in India. It was a recognition that states need to be sovereign, that this idea that you have to choose one side or another is not palatable. And the difference between China and the United States is you have never heard China say, if you do anything with the US, we will punish you. Right? They have said, if you cooperate with the US against China, yes, we will take that as hostile, as anyone would. The US, on the other hand, is saying bluntly, as we just saw with India, you better follow us or you're the enemy. There will be consequences. The world is now past the colonial times. They're not interested in returning to a period, for instance, when India was before the British, 24% of the world's GDP. After the British left, India was 4%. They're not interested in going back to that. They're a proud nation. Every nation is proud. They are what they are, but they don't want to be subservient. They want to go back to it. So why is this emerging now? It isn't. It has been there all along. As I said in the very beginning of when we started talking, you have the three initiatives about development, security, and civilization. This is simply about organization. And you'll notice, and this is the part people should pay attention to, there is no revolution being proposed. What they're saying is this has to be part of the existing structure or reform of the UN to bring in the principles that allow a multilateral world to work. The idea that you're going to impose ideology on other nations, as the United States tried to, is impossible. It hasn't worked. If it had worked, we would not be in this situation. So now In China's estimation, it is time to try something new. As I said, if you go back over these many years since 2013, and you started hearing about these initiatives, sort of things, they have been slowly dropped into, right, the narrative that is pushed out there. Why? Because it takes a long time for change. You don't just pop up and say, I have a new idea, let's do this. You have to show people that there is real substance behind this. 12 years of the Belt and Road Initiative, $1 trillion, networks of working highways, ports, airports, trains, and development. And I think in some ways, this is the most frightening part for some in the developed world. The fact that since early 2000, right, if you start looking at the average development of developing and emerging nations versus developed nations, you're starting to see a trend. That is, the emerging and developing nations are actually exceeding in percentages the growth of their developed partners, or should be partners, developed nations. So instead of wallowing, they have been productive, and that has been enabled by this infrastructure, this concentration on real gains, on being connected, having markets, all right, and providing resources, a global network which has served them, but which the U.S. decided didn't serve U.S. interests because it could not be dominant. Now, keep in mind, 2/3 of all of the profits during this period has gone to developed countries. So this is not a situation as portrayed where jobs were taken. Jobs were shipped overseas by corporations who saw huge benefits, and they took them. Problem is, they did not share them. They kept them at the top. That's why you have the exacerbated situation of inequality that exists economically in all of the developed nations, except a few, perhaps in Europe.
Yeah,
So things,
you know, yeah, no, you have this issue of, through the Belt and Road Initiative, many nations are now participating in the global supply chains much more differently today. You mentioned the fact that, all the manufacturing taking place now. You have, like in Egypt, you get, through Chinese investments, you produce, home appliances on a mass scale, which can compete with Philips and Siemens through the Chinese Haier Corporation or Midea. You can, in Saudi Arabia, Lenovo just started a major laptop and electronics plant where the Saudis can now produce laptops that can compete with HP and other. So China is enabling these nations to become part of the global supply chain rather than being just simple cheap labor, and so this is one of the
fear.
Yeah,
that's
one
what
of
is really motivating all this.
Exactly. The Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry, in explaining the global governance initiative, gives three reasons. One, which you touched upon, is that the erosion of the multilateral system of the United Nations by Western powers, who have created new rules, what they call the rules-based order, that they can change the rules anytime they want to fit their own geopolitical interests and don't give a damn about the United Nations or the UN Charter or anything. So this is very important. And the other thing is what you just mentioned, that nations in the global South are growing in economic power, and their representation, and this is the other point, that should be proportionate to their growth, to their size. So they need to be at the table, not on the menu, to cite the former U.S. Secretary. So these are issues. And also, of course, the third issue is how to implement these principles, which the Chinese side is saying, this is has not been done, because we see things happening around the world where nations violate the sovereignty of other nations, which is a violation of the UN Charter, but they're not being punished. Iran was bombed by Israel for no reason. Of course, the Israelis say they have their own reasons, but that was a violation. There's an ongoing genocide in Gaza, assisted by the United States. Israel is committing, but nobody can intervene. Why? Because the United States is standing in the way and saying, I will not allow anybody to intervene. I will veto things, I will bomb those who will intervene, and so on and so forth. So this is what I think is very, very important, that all these principles of the UN, and it should be, seen in a new light. And I think this is, how do you see this, the totality of this initiative, how it will proceed?
Well, you cited two examples, but Lebanon right now is being indiscriminately bombed by Israel without any consequences, without any condemnation, without any reason than saying, well, I'm afraid, so therefore I get to kill you. I mean, this is the exact opposite of why the United Nations was created. Remember, this was an organization to end wars, not to stand by idly while they happen. So, I thought it was very important that when China had its parade, prominently figured were the peacekeepers that China has been donating. They represent over 50% of that. So once again, I go back to this issue that it's fine to have words, but until you have actions to back those words, no one is going to believe you. I've always thought, what my grandmother said about you lead by example, not by preaching. And this is exactly what I see China's doing. And as you pointed out, it's working. And that has thrown fear into these large corporations who believe it's their right, racially or nationally, to be able to basically use the world as a purse, as something they can take things from while giving very, very little. Those days are gone. They're not coming back. Saudi Arabia isn't going to bend its knee and get rid of its, factories that produce laptops, right? None of these nations are going to do that. And in fact, I predict in a very short while, what you're going to see are the nations who control the commodities that are used by the developed worlds banding together, creating their own bourses, their own trading platforms, and being like OPEC, much more active in terms of setting the price for their commodities rather than being at the mercy of others. I'll give you no better example than coffee. 70% of the world's coffee comes from 4 countries. Yet the coffee industry is dominated by 4 corporations in America and Europe that don't raise one single bean. That has to stop. That is a legacy of colonialism. You see it in the Sahels, in Africa. They've told the French to leave. They're tired of selling their yellow cake for 20 cents euro a kilo, only to have it resold by the French for 2,200.
That's the uranium yellow cake, not the...
Yeah, the yellow cake, yes. So this is an ongoing pattern. These countries are tired of being taken advantage of, but the only thing they can do is band together. And that's what this whole idea of reforming the governance, this is the real threat. People who see a zero-sum game. They don't see opportunities. My grandmother told me, what creativity is? Creativity is when you see opportunities where others see obstacles. And right now, all the West, Europe and America are united in their sense that there are only obstacles. This is the zero-sum mentality.
Yeah.
Whereas China and many other nations are embracing the idea, there are many opportunities and that they can be shared and it can be win-win. And this is what's supporting this idea of global governance initiative. It's the people of the world who are tired of being subjected to others, to having their policies made in foreign capitals, to having their resources, the prices of them determined in foreign bourses for the benefit not of their country, just for the benefit, economic benefit of those outside. I can't think of no other way of describing, this except economic colonialism. Those days are ending. China is playing its part, not in quote leading the world. What they are doing is suggesting a new platform, and they're doing it with others. 150 countries as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. 30 countries and counting, part of the SCO, and that's regional. Then you look at the BRICS, right? A waiting line, countries trying to get in. Do you see anything like that in Europe or the Americas? The only thing you have is NATO. They seem to be, if you don't join us, you're on the menu. So very different ideas between win-win and zero-sum. Right now, the world is voting with their feet.
Yeah, I think this is what you pointed out, the difference between zero-sum game and win-win. I think this is the core philosophical and world outlook, which is the source of all the problems we have since the colonial times, because this idea is that the world is a jungle, like Hobbes says, a fight of all against all around limited resources, because they look at everything as raw materials. That's what counts, not human creativity. And then there is a fight on this little cake. And there's no way to expand that little cake because these resources that exist are limited. And this is scientifically actually nonsense, because all nations can develop and in a reasonable way. China has proven that. India is proving that. Southeast Asia, Africa will prove that. So there's place for everyone. And this is the major obstacle here in the West, because people have been indoctrinated that there is only this little pie. And the ones who can exert power to take as much of that pie as possible, will come out with the winners. And this is where we have actually, and China is contributing to changing this. I know we can expand the pie, we can create new pies, bake new ones, and so on. There is enough. The ocean is big enough for everyone, and this is, I think, very, very important. You mentioned the Victory Day parade in Tiananmen Square in China on the occasion of the defeat of fascism and the surrender of Japan in World War II. Many people, watched that, and even Donald Trump said, and this was impressive. He watched it. But the big question is this China's version of peace through strength? But is it an aggressive one, or is it a new China's Great Wall to defend against war and stop war, not start new wars?
Well, I don't think it's a great wall. Right? I think you have to put this in context. Remember, 150 years ago, what did you have? You had colonial powers who decided first, they went after Japan. They forced it to open up. That set in motion a series of events, the Meiji Restoration, the industrialization of Japan, and then their decision that they should be the colonial masters of Asia. That led directly to World War II, the atrocities that were not only in China, but throughout Asia, including in Korea. Then you have the colonial powers who decided that because they had a thirst for tea, and tea came from China before they stole plants and started making tea in India, that they did not want to pay silver anymore. So they decided to invade. They had a series of wars, the Opium Wars, where they decided that they had the right to poison China with opium that they grew in India, using one colonial nation against another. Why were they successful? because they had superior arms. And they came in. I mean, there was a few hundred troops who went and sacked the Summer Palace. It wasn't a huge, massive invading army. They were able to come in with impunity. China was weak. The military parade made it clear that China is no longer weak. It will not be ravaged by other countries who have some idea that they should be, the colonial masters of others, nor are they going to be subject to the whims of Europe and America in terms of forcing them, either economically or politically, to adopt their ideas. That's what this parade was about, and commemorating the fact that fascism hasn't gone away. The lessons of World War II, how Japan, how Germany convinced ordinary citizens who, if you saw them today, you would say they seem like nice, kind individuals, to devalue life to the point where they could bayonet babies, where they could rape women, kill indiscriminately, like in the rape of Nanjing, 300,000 people killed within a series of weeks. People, you had company commanders who would have killing contests. Who could kill more unarmed people? Can you imagine? So the real monsters are those who make animals out of us, who convince us that others aren't important. We see this in Gaza today. This parade was about reminding people the past is never past, that you have to be vigilant against these monsters arising again. I mean, if you had gone to Israel 6 years ago, the idea, despite the fact that it was still a nation that was running an apartheid things, that the people you saw on the street, the young men and women, would be willing to shoot babies in the head for, in essence, target practice, to gather them around because they're starving and then indiscriminately shoot and bomb them. It would not have occurred to you. But yet their government has pushed these fascist ideas, and they have so completely brainwashed their people into believing that if you're a Palestinian, if you're a Muslim, if you're an Arab, your life has no meaning. In fact, you're doing the right thing by exterminating it. This is the ugly part of our humanity, and is something that, unless we remember, unless we prevent other countries like Japan from pretending that Nanjing was an incident where they were trying to help the local people. This is taught in their textbooks to grade school students, not acknowledging what they did, but simply saying it. At the top levels, they say, oh, we're guilty of nothing except losing. These types of people are the real danger. We can see the atrocities created by individuals, but you don't see, all right, the vast network of people who are influencing, who are creating these animals deliberately. People like Netanyahu, people in his cabinet who openly say that it's time to eradicate the Palestinians. These are things that should never have happened. We swore that they would never happen again. That's why the United Nations was created. And now the United Nations stands idly by while it happens, as you pointed out. So it is time for the nations to gather together to come to a new compact, one that's creative, looks for the opportunities, one that is inclusive, that respects all nations, and one that believes that the world can win, not zero sum.
That was very, very important to point out, so people understand the background to this and why China would show such a level of armed power, but at the same time talk about peace. I was shocked a bit. I visited the Chinese National Museum at the same place in the Tiananmen area. And it was called the Road to Rejuvenation. That's the title of one section of the museum, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But you have the first two floors is about how China was humiliated, the century of humiliation. And I thought it was very strange that a nation would exhibit how it was humiliated. Most nations, like in the Champs-Élysées and the Arc of Triumph in France, they will only show their victories, in their museums, how triumphant and how great they were, but never when they were defeated or humiliated. But now I understand, why people, the Chinese people, also people of the world, have to see that reality, that truth, what you have just expressed, in order to go to the next stage. In China, they call it the rejuvenation of the nation. I think President Xi Jinping coined that term after visiting that museum, I think in 2012, after he was become the Secretary General of the party. But the idea is you do that to establish peace, to prevent war. This, I think, I was also shocked to read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, because it's mostly about how to avoid fighting. You can achieve your goals without fighting. And then this is a very, very important philosophical mindset, which is a bit different than, peace through strength, which Donald Trump expresses, which means, peace will be achieved when all the Palestinians are dead and you build a Riviera there, and it will be very quiet, a nice place when everybody's dead, the peace of the graveyard. So anyway, since we are still in the question of the victory over fascism in World War II, and President Trump was a bit upset. Actually, he should have been at the celebration himself. That nobody cares about the great contributions the United States did in supporting China and others to win World War II. But China does honor the American heroes and heroes from other nations who stood with China, like the so-called Flying Tigers and others. I knew a person personally, and now deceased person, is an American thinker and economist, Lyndon LaRouche. He was deployed in Burma during World War II as a young man with the specific mission of supplying the Chinese resistance in the Yunnan province, through the Yunnan province, by dropping materials and ammunition and other things to the Chinese resistance. So this is known, and the problem is that the American people don't know that. That this was a fight of all humanity against fascism and Nazism and the bestiality which was exhibited by those. So how is that reflected inside China? Do the Chinese recognize that this was not simply only China's fight, but it was a common fight for all humanity?
Okay. I want to go to your first point about history. When you're an empire, it is only about victories. You're always expanding, you're always taking things from others. That's the empire view. I am strong, I take. So you don't have much use for history. Right? You're creating it, and you want to whitewash it after you've finished. In a civilization, you study history to avoid the mistakes of history. This is very important. I mean, I've read through Chinese analects Chinese histories, where they cover known periods during, different dynasties, and it's a daily chronicle of everything that happened. And this is part of mandatory requirements for leaders in China. All the emperors had to study this. And now it falls to those within government to understand that history teaches you how, as you put it, Sun Tzu, how to avoid battles, how to win without killing. And this is a very, very important difference between an empire and a civilization. And that's what you're looking at here. In terms of Chinese acknowledgement of the sacrifices and bravery of those who helped it, not only the Flying Tigers, but within Nanjing, the people who saved almost 200,000 people by trying to carve out an area to prevent the Japanese from killing and raping women and children and men who had nothing to do, were not military, they were just civilians. They are honored. Their stories are put into museums. They have shows about them. They honor them. Many of the second and third generations of these brave individuals were present, right, during the parade, and they were honored. They were interviewed, talked about the family legacy of somebody who was willing to stand up while others did nothing. But the Flying Tigers, although they had the acknowledgement of the US government, was not being run by the US. It was volunteers from all sorts of countries, as you put it, who were fighting against the fascism and terror that Japan was waging, not only in China, but in Korea and throughout Asia. This is something that the world should never forget, and it's part of what I was saying earlier. You do not want fascism to grow. You have to be reminded. You have to study history. You have to study Sun Tzu so that you understand what evil is and how you combat it. So these are the lessons of history. As I said, unfortunately, Donald Trump doesn't understand the lessons of history because he doesn't read history and he doesn't care about it. In terms of his reaction to the parade, he said it was beautiful. You could detect the envy after his rather pathetic showing in Washington that still costs American taxpayers $10 to $15 million. I mean, what a shame. But it also underlines something else, which is very important to keep in mind. Donald Trump, since he was a child, although he was born into wealth, was from Queens. He tried to be part of the Manhattan crowd. He was now the man from Mar-a-Lago. But he was always rejected by the cool kids. And his whole life has been almost dedicated to becoming one of them. So for him to see Modi and Putin, Xi, who he sees as his equals, laughing and cajoling, and he has to wonder about who they're talking about, doesn't he? He's once again that man sitting on the side, rejected by the cool kids. It's going to have an enormous effect on him. Fortunately, I wish to say it would cause him to reflect, but he's not a person who reflects, as he put in his own autobiography. I wake up every day and I try to maximize that day. I don't think about the past and I don't think about tomorrow unless it's beneficial to me. This is the kind of man we're dealing with. It's the kind of man America has elected. It's clear that in the coming midterm elections, his party will be pushed out, will lose control of Congress and the Senate. The question is, will he turn to authoritarians? We already see him out there nibbling at the edges, putting the army at the border, sending troops into LA, Washington, now Chicago, New Orleans, other countries, other cities, coincidentally, all controlled by Democratic parties. I mean, is this a dress rehearsal for what he plans later on? Remember, he discussed the idea of declaring the election he lost as a cheat and taking over things over militarily before. This is what keeps me up at night and should keep other people up at night. How far is he willing to go to avoid the embarrassment of losing control over a government that he has no policies for, only seems self-enrichment? $5 billion has been added to his family's net worth in the last week, while the rest of the world was looking on perhaps a hopeful future for everybody, he was enriching himself. These are things that worry me. And I hope that those watching will also consider this. It's time we come together, stop the selfishness, think about how we can win-win instead of how we can take what little is on the table.
Well, wonderful. Einar, I hope this message reaches as many people as possible because the core issue here is how we can have a peaceful world, a prosperous world for everyone. And this is really a great message to send to people. So thank you very, very much for your insightful contribution to us and to our viewers. And we are very happy to have you here, and we'll be very happy to have you here again to discuss these very important issues. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for having me. I appreciate it. I always enjoy our conversations.
My pleasure.